Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from around the world. I'm Karen Yarhimilo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs here at Columbia University. And thank you for joining us to a rapid response webinar on the recent development and situation in Russia and the implications for Putin's regime and the war in Ukraine. It is wonderful to be with you for the next hour, where we're going to have an interesting conversation with a panel of experts from SIPA and about the situation, and we will follow up with Q&A from the audience. So I will start by framing this, and then we will dive into our panelists. Days ago, Yevgeny, I'm sorry, can you hear me okay? Okay, sorry, somebody was not muted. Days ago, Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of Wagner Group, a private military company playing a key role in the conflict in Ukraine, as you know, appeared to lead a revolt against Russian President Vladimir Putin. This was an extraordinary sign of tumult within Russia, and after allegedly occupying the key military hub of Rostov-on-Don, Prigozhin was charged with organizing an armed insurrection. Now, 24 hours later, in an about face, it was announced that the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, had broken a deal that led to the Russian state dropping charges against Prigozhin and Wagner Group fighters returning to their training camp. And it seems that some Wagner Group fighters will be offered the opportunity to sign contracts with Russia's military. Now, at a speech on Monday, Putin said that Wagner's mutiny would have been crushed by Russian security forces if it not halted its advance on Moscow, but also that the vast majority of Wagner fighters were patriots. Prigozhin, meanwhile, released a statement that the march on Moscow was not an attempt to topple the government, but to prevent his group from being destroyed. Now, the situation in Russia remains uncertain as Putin faces the largest civil military crisis of his long-standing presidency. So today, we have a true privilege to be joined by three of SIPA's leading experts on Russia and conflict. We have Dr. Kimberly Martin, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Barnard College and a member of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace at SIPA. We have Dr. Peter Clement, is the interim director of the Arnold Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies here at SIPA. And we have Dr. Steve Biddle, who's a professor of international and public affairs here at SIPA, as well as the director of the school's international security policy concentration. Thank you all for being with us and taking the time to offer this analysis. And I'm really excited to hear what they think about what this weekend's events mean for Russia's future, the war in Ukraine, and obviously the global security implications this might have. So for those of you who are tuning in, you can submit questions to our experts using the webinar's Q&A function, which we will turn to at the end of the session. So now, without further ado, I want to dive into our panelists. And Dr. Martin, I will start with you. You're one of the foremost experts on the Wagner Group. Now, can you give us a background to the situation by telling us what the Wagner Group is, why it was useful to Russia, and a bit about its leader, Prigozhin? What kind of relationship does he have with Putin, and why might he have done so? I know, a lot of questions to unpack.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen, for allowing me to join you today. I'm looking forward to this discussion. So the Wagner Group is a contracting mechanism for primarily the Russian military intelligence agency. It has never been the kind of private military company that we have grown accustomed to in the West. And in fact, Putin revealed that information today in breaking news that happened just before we started here, saying that in fact, all of the Wagner Group's activities in Ukraine have been directly funded by the Russian state. And then he added, we hope that nobody has stolen anything, or at least they haven't stolen too much, but we will be looking into this, which is a suggestion that perhaps even if Prigozhin was forgiven for leading whatever revolt he tried on Saturday, that his legal troubles in Russia are not over. But the Wagner Group got its start long before Prigozhin was part of it. It first started in eastern Ukraine in 2014. Then it went into Syria in 2015. It has been deployed throughout Africa, and it is still in the Central African Republic. It is in Mali. It is in eastern Libya. And it has performed really a wide variety of functions for the Russian state, ranging from acting as common infantry to acting as very high-level, highly disciplined snipers, occasionally using air forces, engaging in military training for foreign countries, sometimes engaging in mafia-like activities where people are threatened if they won't go along with what Russia wants. And so it's been incredibly usable, incredibly flexible, and the major purpose that it has served for the defense ministry is to avoid having casualties among regular Russian uniformed forces for dangerous activities. It's also been less expensive than sending the uniformed Russian military places. Prigozhin himself started life as a convict in Soviet times. He was a common street criminal who engaged in robbery and burglary. He was put into prison on, I think it was a 12-year term. He got out 2 years early, which means he probably made a deal with the KGB, which is then what became the FSB, the Russian Domestic Intelligence Agency. At the time he got out, Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, responsible for overseeing business development and contracts. So as Prigozhin got his contracts for the hot dog stand and the grocery stores and the restaurants in St. Petersburg, that's how his relationship with Putin started. And they were also both associated with the same organized criminal gang that was then very active in St. Petersburg. When Putin went to Moscow, he took Prigozhin with him as a caterer, as somebody who did cleaning contracting for the Russian military. And way back in those days, even before Prigozhin was associated with the Wagner Group, he fought with the defense ministry over the question of how much money was being spent and whether he was stealing from them. And so we see this development over time where the defense ministry needs Prigozhin and needs the Wagner Group forces for what they're doing, but their relationship has never been comfortable. And then in the last couple of months, we've seen Prigozhin getting angrier and angrier and angrier at the defense ministry and making all kinds of personal accusations. And so that is the background for what happened on Saturday.
That's a great recap and analysis. Thank you, Dr. Martin. So let me turn now to Peter Clement. Peter, this is obviously a hugely consequential event for Russia's domestic politics. Your experience working on Russia with the CIA for many years, including your most recent position as Deputy Assistant Director of CIA for Europe and Eurasia, and your past tours as Director of the Office of Russian and Eurasian Analysis and CIA's Russia Issue Manager. That experience has given you a unique insight into the situation. And in your opinion, Peter, just how much has this event affected Putin's power? Is Putin weaker than he was, let's say, a week ago? And if he's weaker, what steps might he take to reinforce his position? Oh, you're muted, Peter.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks for having me at this event today too. And nice to see Kim and Steve as well. Big question. I will confess there were days in the past 3 or 4 days that I really wished I was back in my old job, because I would have loved to have seen some of the intelligence that now people are talking about that the agency reportedly had days before Prigozhin took this bold move. The short answer to your question, I think absolutely Putin appears weaker, no question, than he did a week ago. I'd even argue since the ill-fated invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, where ill-fated here is critical, he's made several big mistakes. That was one. I think the other big mistake, which is contributing to this semblance of weakness, is that he actually allowed the Wagner Group to become the force that it was, and to allow them to engage in this amazing contretemps publicly. And it was pretty nasty between Prigozhin and the MOD. To most people looking at that, you'd say that that's not a healthy organization, especially when you're fighting a major land war on your border. The immediate precipitating event for this episode here, this rebellion, and Prigozhin has stated this clearly, was the January 11th decree issued by the MOD, which said all these contract forces will now have to sign new contracts by July 1, which would basically subordinate them to the MOD. For Prigozhin, this was, and Kim, feel free to jump in here, you're basically taking my guys away and saying, then I have a different boss, literally. To me, that's another sign of weak leadership on Putin's part. Why do you allow this to happen in the first place? The flip side of this, because there's always another side, when people say Putin is vulnerable, he's weaker, that's true in this aspect. But the flip side of this is, I didn't hear anybody anywhere among the elites or in the leadership circles come to Prigozhin's side on this. They either stayed mum, or a few of them made public statements about the need to restore order and observe the Constitution. Putin has a huge military security and police apparatus at his disposal. He's still pretty powerful, so I'm less worried about that. One thing that's worth noting here, people are wondering, why did Putin allow this to get so far out of hand? Why didn't he crush it? And I think Putin actually played this very smartly. Arguably, he could have launched a serious assault on this convoy that was going up the highway and destroyed them all. But in doing so, the entire country would be watching this, a major bloodletting of your own forces, one against the other. He probably figured out that wasn't such a great idea. Hence, we have this compromise that was reached, which, to be honest, and I think a lot of us have many questions, what exactly were the terms of that deal? and how viable is it beyond getting through the next week or two? One last point before I go here. Putin has several challenges to face. One is he needs to get this behind him. He needs to get the Wagner issue resolved. And I think the speech that he made last night was a critical opening salvo in that strategy. He basically is trying to divide and conquer. He said, you have a choice. You can sign up as kontratniki, working for the MOD, or you can go to Belarus. Let's go see how that plays out. I think that's a little risky too. 20,000 of them go to Belarus with Prigozhin. Do we have yet another entity there? And who do they really report to? That's the opening move. He needs to see how that plays out. Once this gets played out, and this may take a while, then he's got another issue to wrestle with. How do you recapture the narrative and restore your argument about why you went to war in Ukraine? Prigozhin actually undermined Putin's very rationale for going to war. He needs to recapture that narrative and try to explain it away somehow. That's another issue for another time.
So thank you, Peter. So let me just follow up. How do you assess Putin's immediate reaction based on what he said and what he did, especially with regards to two things? How worried was he about the so-called coup? And second, what do we learn about him and his psychology, the fact that he was willing to reach this compromise? What does it tell you about how we negotiate with him and bargain with him?
I think it does attest to his, he clearly was caught off guard in my view. He must have had intelligence, but the speech that he gave the first night, I was frankly taken aback that he described it in such broad, frightening terms, comparing it to 1917 in Russia. To me, that was startling. So he must have been taken a little by surprise. And it certainly, to me, gave the semblance of he was feeling a little weak and vulnerable. Not to a coup per se, but that he had a big problem now that he had to manage.
Thank you, Peter. And as for what are the implications? What do we learn about him? The fact that he was willing to compromise. Can we infer anything about his willingness to negotiate when he's pushed against the wall?
I think it's a good question. I think in this case, he realized he wasn't in a strong position. He took some time to do this, and then decided, okay, I've got to find a way out of here. And he offered this compromise. That definitely is a little bit of a sign of vulnerability, if you will, a weakness. But I also, this is a man who's very, very vengeful. I would not feel so comfortable if I were Prigozhin just yet. He's buying some time, and we'll see how effectively he can manage this, but we're not out yet. I'd like to think of this as a book with 5 chapters, and we're in chapter 2.
Chapter 2, yeah, okay. Thanks, Peter. Now, one question that observers had is really how close Prigozhin plausibly could have come to succeeding. And with us is Dr. Biddle. And in addition to your groundbreaking work on modern warfare, you've served on the Defense Department's Defense Policy Board and on strategic assessment teams during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, advising the US military at the highest level. So Steve, given your expertise, could you walk us through how viable was Prigozhin's putsch militarily? What would have happened if he had continued to walk to Moscow? And in other words, did he have a chance?
Yeah, I mean, I think Peter's right that Putin was clearly surprised by this and caught with his pants down. I mean, it may be that Ukrainian and American intelligence knew more about this than Putin did, which would be an interesting state of affairs if true. The forces that the Russian government had available to defend Moscow in the short term were not well configured for this mission. So there were light National Guard elements, very limited heavy weaponry, very limited armor support. They were reduced to the extraordinary expedient of parking civilian dump trucks across the Voronezh-Moscow highway in an attempt to block this column's movement. So in the short term, given that the Russian Federation was caught so much by surprise and was so poorly disposed to deal with this, it's unlikely that the National Guard could have kept Prigozhin out of Moscow if Prigozhin had continued to advance. We don't know a lot about the composition of this column that Wagner was sending toward the capital, but it included at least several thousand troops, at least a company or more of T-90 tanks, mobile air defense. This is a pretty heavily armed conventional military formation. The forces in Moscow were not disposed for conventional slugfests against heavily armed opponents. So in all likelihood, if Prigozhin had decided he wanted to do it, he could have gotten into the city of Moscow. The problem is it's easy to get in, but what do you then do?
Right.
The entire Wagner Group is probably not large enough to control a city the size of Moscow.
Right.
And certainly the detachment of it that was headed into the city wasn't large enough. So the whole issue of the prognosis of this adventure depended in an important degree on what, if any, effect it had on the rest of the Russian military. Does the rest of, and this is common in coups, right? Some people have argued that this is was a mutiny rather than a coup. That's an important distinction that we can talk about if anybody wants to. But in a coup, typically the outcome depends on what the military at large does. Do they stand back? Do they side with the plotters, or do they side with the government? If they'd sided with the government, they would have crushed Wagner.
Right.
But crushing Wagner in the middle of the city of Moscow would have been an impressive bloodletting in the middle of a heavily occupied city that is the heart of the Russian state.
Right.
And it would certainly appear that Putin decided that that wasn't a good optic, right? Suggesting that you're in charge and you're in control and you're the iron fist that's controlling Russia, as there's a firefight going on through large parts of downtown Moscow and tanks driving around on YouTube videos. None of this, I think, would have looked good. The short-term prognosis for Prigozhin is he almost certainly could have gotten into Moscow. The long-term prognosis is if he didn't persuade the rest of the Russian military or large parts of it to side with him, eventually he was going to be toast. And that then leads to larger questions that I will defer to my Russian studies colleagues on about what was Prigozhin thinking?
Okay.
Uh,
That is the million-dollar question, right? What was the end game and what was he thinking? Thank you, Steve. And we will get back to you to tell us more about the implications of this militarily. Going back to you, Peter, and kind of related question, let's talk a little bit about the rhetoric surrounding this event. So the question is, people might wonder, why did Putin allow and even encourage at some point this kind of intense war of words between Prigozhin and Gerasimov? And why do you think Prigozhin is challenging Putin's rationale for the war? Do you think that his challenging the rationale for the war now is going to begin to resonate with the elites in Russia? Will it be kind of resonate in terms of challenging the Putin's regime more broadly? What do you make of both the exchange in terms of the rhetoric and the rationale for the war that we're beginning? Is it the beginning of to see cracks in the control over the narrative?
Great questions, Karen. First, I will confess, I was always a little perplexed that he was allowing this war of words between the MOD and Prigozhin. And as I thought more about it, I mean, that is a little bit of his modus operandi in the past. When there were conflicts within the elites or among the oligarchs or within the bureaucracy about turf wars, about who had the authority over what, Putin usually either actively allowed or sometimes even encouraged, because it strengthened his position as the ultimate arbiter. He would have to step in at the end, and everybody understood he was the guy who had to be won over. And increasingly that would attenuate his power. That's fine when you're dealing with bureaucrats in suits and oligarchs with money bags. When you're dealing with people with guns, I think that's a huge miscalculation, as we've now seen, because Prigozhin obviously decided, he's not hearing me. I'm telling you how bad the MOD leadership is, how bad the war's going, and nobody's listening to me. You're not getting rid of them. I'm going to have to send a message.
Mm-hmm.
And he did. And very risky. And I still don't fully understand how Prigozhin thought he would get away with this. What was his end game? Did he actually believe? I'm totally with you, Kim. He must have started to believe his own press and media, that he was so powerful and everybody knew who he was and he'd done so well that people might actually side with him or something. It's truly remarkable. On the second question about the rationale, this is a huge one, and I think this is the other big challenge he needs to overcome. If a lot of Russians heard what Prigozhin said about the basis, the origin of this war, that's very disturbing. It's not a good way to encourage new conscription and people joining the military when you're told it's all about corrupt leaders who want to enrich themselves or hive off parts of Ukraine so they can further enrich themselves or enable Shoigu to get another star. My last point, which relates to the issue of power, I am starting to wonder now if people, who knows, people around Putin or near him are beginning to say, you know, he's 0 for 2 now on 2 really big decisions, the invasion decision, and now this decision to let this festering war go on between the two. And is he losing it? Was his time with COVID, is he so into his other world of obsessing with Russian history that he has lost the reality touch? Does he really understand the implications of what he's doing? That sets this possibility, potential for people organizing, although that's a risky business. Who do you talk to? If you're a plotter, who among that inner circle would you talk to start this process? Because you don't know who still is with Putin.
That's right. And so one more question before we move to the future implications. And this question is to you, Kim and Peter together. So if this, if Putin declared this as rebellion, if this rebellion is, act of treason, why he didn't take a stronger action against Prigozhin, both during the march and also in terms of the final deals? What options were available to him, in your opinion, and why he chose the one that he did? Kim, you want to
Sure.
take it first. Yeah.
Those are great questions, Karen. And a few things to keep in mind. First of all, Prigozhin is not a military leader. He has no combat experience. His only role in Wagner was as the contractor, the middleman. According to Russian social media, he stayed in his position as long as he did because he knew who to pay off and how much, which sort of fits his whole history of being this contractor for the state, for the very corrupt Russian state, and of having started out as a common criminal. The second thing to keep in mind is that Putin has always valued loyalty above all else, and Putin has wanted to show loyalty. He has wanted to show that he takes care of the people who are his own. And he and Prigozhin had a pretty long history. And so I think that might also have contributed to the slowness of his reaction, wanting to make sure that it didn't appear that he was throwing his longtime servant under the bus unnecessarily. But then I think Peter is right that Prigozhin was actually playing an important role for Putin in his criticisms of Shoigu, of the military leadership, because it was putting some space between Putin's decision-making and military decision-making. And it was the military who was making all the mistakes in Ukraine. And that's why things were going so slowly, not Putin. And in fact, for everything that Prigozhin said, Prigozhin never criticized Putin by name. And even when he talked about Putin's justification for the war in Ukraine as being wrong, he blamed the military leadership for having made that argument rather than blaming the Kremlin or Putin himself.
Right.
And so I think their relationship has been extraordinarily complex. I would also note that as Prigozhin was marching forward to Moscow, as far as we know, he didn't actually take over the entire military apparatus in Rostov because he moved so quickly and he was able to exit so quickly. There's no way in the world that all of his men were operating everything that was involved in that. It was more that the military allowed him to come in without bothering him than that he actually took over the Rostov command post. And as we watch the video of Prigozhin's forces moving towards Moscow, a couple of things to keep in mind. Many of them were just in military trucks that didn't have any protection. And so they may very well have had tank forces along with them, but it was not just tank forces. And that sort of leads to the idea that Prigozhin was telling the truth when he said that he was not trying to launch a military coup, that he was trying to send a message, that he was trying to send a protest message. The other thing that we've learned through the videos, which have appeared on Twitter in the last couple of days, is that there was civilian traffic that was intermingled with that because these highways weren't closed off. And so if Putin had taken stronger military action, it would also have involved Russian military forces killing innocent Russian civilians who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But of course, as Peter pointed out earlier, there was bloodshed. The Russian military forces announced that there were 13 pilots who were killed when they attempted to, it's not clear that they shot on Prigozhin's forces or that they were just hovering near Prigozhin, and Prigozhin's men fired on them and killed 13 pilots for the Russian Air Force. And Prigozhin later said, oh, that was just some trigger-happy folks that were along with me. That wasn't what I was doing. Well, of course, it wasn't what he was doing because he's not the commander. He was not giving the orders. But furthermore, Prigozhin said, I will give payments to the families in return for the deaths, which is sort of what you expect invading forces to do in foreign countries. It's not what you expect somebody like Prigozhin to do in Russia. So I think, I mean, there are a lot of mysteries that we don't have answered, and it's not clear what Prigozhin is going to be doing in Belarus. It could be that he is bringing a new Wagner force presence there, either to support Lukashenko staying in power, or to perhaps give Lukashenko sort of an implicit threat that if he does something wrong, we now have the ability to unseat you with these Russian forces that are here. It's also possible that the presence in Belarus will somehow be used for further Russian fighting in the Ukraine war. We just don't know at this point.
Thank you, Kim. Peter, what are the odds that Prigozhin is alive by the end of the year? Is still alive? Wow,
that's another one of those questions. I don't know anybody has the answer, but let's this way: I wouldn't buy a lottery ticket on it. Hey, can I make a quick point, Kim? I totally agree with what you just said here. One of the questions I had, and see if you agree with this, I couldn't understand how Prigozhin shows up stuff to the military headquarters and everybody just sits around the table and they kibitz. And as I thought about this more, I thought these local commanders are actually pretty smart. they don't want to have a bloodshed either. What's the point in shooting at these guys? And my bureaucrats' answer to this is, you know what? This is way above my pay grade. I'm going to let the powers that be sort this out, but I'm not going to start shooting at this guy. Why?
Yeah.
And ditto, Prigozhin figures, what's the point? The other question I had was, if they decided it's better just stand down, then why did somebody decide to send these helicopters in a threatening mode over the convoy and then get shot down, no less? And I wonder if this was a game of signaling and communicating, that
Yeah.
basically Putin was saying, you know, this is getting too far.
Yeah.
You guys need to knock it off, because if we have to, we can
We
make
will
this
have to.
really ugly. And then
Yeah.
they stop. So
Yeah.
maybe that's what happened. But as you say, there's so many things we just don't know.
So let's move on to this kind of the second part of this discussion, which is really about what are the implications moving forward. So let's start with you, Kim. What's the future of the Wagner group? Are there other similar groups that might take on some of their roles? What do you think will happen?
That's a great question, Karen. And yes, there have always been groups that have also been contractors on security issues for Russia, although as far as we know, others of these groups have not yet engaged in combat, which is something that the Wagner Force group did both in Africa and in Ukraine and in Syria. You know, the Wagner Group is such a complex thing. It's not really an organization. It's not really a group. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, made a statement yesterday where he reassured African leaders that Russian support for them would not change, that they would still continue to get the military training, quote unquote, that the Wagner forces were giving them. What it actually is that the Wagner forces are going out on field exercises with them. There was just a report released today, a fantastic report on what's happening in the Central African Republic that has said that the Wagner forces have essentially taken over the leadership role of the Central African Republic. So there they have something that very much serves the interests of the Russian state. And even if the name gets changed, it's likely to be the same people in the same positions doing the same thing. The Wagner Group has not been fighting in Ukraine since May. And so probably the direct impact on fighting in Ukraine will not be substantial. But as Peter pointed out, the question is, what effect will this have on military morale? And we don't really know what information the forces who are currently fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Russia got. They supposedly had their cell phones taken away from them, but we know not all of them did. And so we don't know if they've been following this in real time and what that's going to mean for the actual battlefield process of what's happening in Ukraine right now. But the Wagner Group was not in Ukraine. And so, you know, we don't know what's going to happen when they go into Belarus. I think a lot of things are possible. The Gazprom, the Russian gas, big gas monopoly, has formed 3 of its own volunteer forces to go help in Ukraine in the last couple of months. There's a Wagner spinoff in Crimea that is somewhat associated with Wagner that seems to be taking on similar roles in Russian-occupied Crimea. And so even if Prigozhin disappears, I think it's entirely possible that something very much like the Wagner Group is going to continue, whether or not it has the Wagner Group name associated with it. But keep in mind, it's not a private military company. It's not actually a group.
Right. Yes. Thank you. This is great. Steve, now turning to you. So we're trying to understand, we're trying to infer from what just happened some things about the Russia's military as well. And here in this case, we have Prigozhin was, he was able to drive to within a few hundred kilometers of Moscow, shoot down at least 7 Russian aircraft, kill several dozen Russian pilots and soldiers, and apparently with virtually no casualty to his own mercenaries, right? So what does it tell us from this incident? What does it tell us about the effectiveness of the Russian military?
Nothing good, right? If you're a Russian, that this is not an organization that historically has displayed a lot of initiative and a lot of ability to respond quickly to surprising events, and that's pretty much what we saw during this march towards Moscow, right? I mean, the vast majority of the Russian military probably said, "I don't know what to do about this. I don't have any orders." to deal with this situation. And their response, when lots of apparently anti-regime forces are driving by them in a column, was to do nothing.
Yeah.
A. B, when somebody in the chain of command decided that maybe a heavily armed column driving towards Moscow isn't a good thing, and gave somebody some orders to operate aircraft against the column, nobody did any suppression of air defense. I mean, this was not a coordinated air response. The most vulnerable air target in the history of warfare is a large column strung out on along a road in constant movement. And yet, whatever Air Force was directed against this column was apparently unable to inflict any casualties, lost 7 of their own aircraft. This was not a well-coordinated military response. The issue for the larger war going forward is the one I think that Peter and Ken both cited, the question of what morale effect this is or is not going to have on the Russian forces at the front. It certainly suggests, though, that the kind of battle we're seeing in Ukraine right now is the only kind that the Russian military is currently configured as particularly good at. A set piece battle that can be pre-organized and can be carried out by preliminary orders. When they're forced to adapt on the fly to a changing situation, there's very little evidence that they're able to respond quickly to it. If the Ukrainians somehow manage to break through a very tall order, the Russian military's ability to respond to them in Ukraine may be not a lot better than the ability they demonstrated to respond to Prigozhin driving to Moscow.
Very, very interesting. And I want to go back to the war in Ukraine in a second. Before I do so, Peter, let me ask you again, in this kind of context of drawing inferences from this, what does this tell you about the loyalty of the Russian armed forces to Putin? Anything that we see this is the beginning of the end for him in terms of loyalty from the military, or actually the opposite? Now you will see even more.
Good question, Karen. The fact that nobody acted to enlist in this struggle with Prigozhin tells me most of the people in the MOD, they've made their decisions. They're with Putin. But having said that, I do think Putin is going to be a little suspicious because that's his nature. He's got to be asking the question we just asked. Why did Prigozhin think this might actually work? Which then leads to the other question, were there others involved? Was he talking to others? Did he actually think that maybe there's some people in different places who might want to work with him? In which case you need to have an investigation. I'm not going to be at all surprised. There's a quiet investigation that's already begun to sniff out, were there any signs of disloyalty or people making phone calls or anything with the other side that we need to be aware of? I suspect this gets to the broader issue of, at a minimum, he needs to secure his domestic position. He needs to know for sure there's nobody in the group or in his elites that are somehow thinking other thoughts about who might be leader here. Then the second one is recapturing the narrative on this war. He does have to somehow square the circle, because what Prigozhin revealed is pretty disturbing. He needs to reinforce why we went to war. There's lots of evidence. There was NATO infrastructure being built. Zelensky was constantly talking about we have to get into NATO soon, soon, soon. There's a reason we did this. So ignore all that stuff about corruption and people wanting things. We had to go to war. He's got to justify that and reinforce it again.
So, Peter, wearing your hat as a former intelligence analyst, what should Langley be monitoring right now?
Oh my gosh. I actually, when this broke out, my first thought was, A, I wish I was there to see what's going on, and B, if I was running the office, there'd be a task force immediately had been set up and you'd be on 24/7. I would assume you want to focus on the military comms to the extent you still have them. And then if you've got active sources, hopefully there are some, just try to sniff out what are people in higher levels saying or thinking, and how are they assessing how Putin did react? Was this in fact a sign of weakness? Was he nervous? What Steve said, the fact that they were so unprepared and took were lining up cars to blockade the streets, and there was video footage of them digging up highways as a way of stopping the convoy. To me, those were signs of, wow, a little bit of scary desperation. That
Right.
you're actually worried they're going to get to Moscow, and then what am I going to do? So there may be people having second thoughts about his decision making here.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Peter. Steve, going back to you. So can we just pause for a second? Because this is all happening in the midst of a war that is in Ukraine that the Russian military is fighting. And in fact, we are in an ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive. So what is the progress and prognosis of the Ukrainian counteroffensive given this new development? Kim told us that the Wagner forces have not been active since May. But in terms of morale, that's one key factor. Anything else that you can tell us about how the war is going and what this could have, and what effect it could have on the war?
Yeah, I mean, as Kim pointed out, there won't be much, if any, near-term effect. The longer-term issue is will to fight in the Russian army. I mean, the pattern in the war so far has been that when attackers strike poorly prepared, very thin defenses, they can take ground and succeed, but otherwise not. So there's been plenty of experience in this war of what happens when modern military strike deep, prepared, reserve provisioned, defensive positions. They make very, very slow progress. And that's what the Ukrainians are stuck with right now. The entire front is deep and well prepared. The Russians have been anticipating this offensive for months and months and months. And progress so far has been very slow. Now, the argument that it can succeed is premised on the idea that casualties are very heavy on both sides, and that the limited size of the Russian army combined with morale problems in the Russian army will eventually cause them to break. And it just requires this elaborate, Verdun-like slugfest to get you to the point where eventually Russia is bled dry at the point of attack and their morale breaks. This is a very, very challenging form of warfare, but again, so much of it turns on combat motivation that there's this big question going forward about, whether Russian defenses that have held, quite resiliently so far in this counteroffensive will be able to continue to do so. And so these open questions about what Russians at the front know about what's been happening in Moscow and what Putin's response tells them. Again, I think a big part of the reason why Prigozhin is still alive, right? Why Putin hasn't retaliated much more aggressively than he has, is because the physical military instruments for immediate crushing of Wagner that were available to Putin would have created a massive firefight in the city of Moscow. And that would have had effects at the front in Ukraine that I don't think Putin was willing to try.
So let me ask a question now to all three of you, whoever wants to jump in, thinking about the psychology of Putin, right? We know from the literature, from prospect theory, and, if this is a kind of a case where Putin feels that he suffered humiliation, a kind of a loss in terms of, loss in loyalty from that we expect them, those kinds of leaders, when they feel that they've been humiliated, to actually recover by, taking even greater risks. That's the kind of risk-taking behavior that we see in a domain of loss. This is all prospect theory, Kahneman and Tversky, and so on. So, Kim, let's start with you. Do you fear this type of coming back with vengeance as a result of this humiliation for Putin? Is this something to be concerned about?
Yeah, just a couple of things to keep in mind. One of the reasons that Putin may have been allowing Prigozhin to do what he did for so long is that he was afraid of a military coup. We know that Putin has a tendency to be paranoid. And so by having Prigozhin as a counter, that was sort of keeping the military on its toes. And it's really interesting that what he did today was give out a bunch of military medals to people, congratulating them for their defense of the state, which of course they didn't do. And so it was fake, but he was showing the military that that he was on their side and that he still wanted the military behind him. We also saw that he launched a major strike into Ukraine yesterday that killed, again, many, many civilians. I think it was actually this morning in the same place that he had hit a year ago, a civilian area. And so I think that, yes, we're going to probably see vicious attacks happening in Ukraine, as we have already, but probably multiplying, even as Russia is on the defense in Ukraine against this Ukrainian counteroffensive, still continuing these terrible strikes against civilians. And Peter and I were talking about this a couple days ago, and I think that Peter and I probably agree that also Putin is likely to have a much stronger crackdown internally. He's going to become very paranoid about his own defenses internally. And so we will see probably a tightening up rather than a loosening of the way that he approaches domestic politics in Russia and allows people to speak out against him. He's going to learn from this and not allow the same thing to happen again. It's not clear to me how many more risks Putin can take. He's already taken a huge number, the most recent of which was causing that dam in Ukraine to be blown up. That wasn't, obviously a use of a nuclear weapon, but it did so much destruction, including to areas that were under Russian military control, that he's already way out there on risk taking. And so I wouldn't be surprised about any risk he takes next.
Steve, do you think of any kind of enhancement in terms of risk-taking behavior in the battlefield as a result of this?
Oh, risk-taking behavior on the battlefield, behind the battle. I mean, one of the biggest perils in this war for the United States and for countries outside Ukraine and Russia is the risk of escalation. And one of the standard phrases you hear in the escalation literature is gambling for resurrection. That, as you're pointing out, when people think they're in the domain of losses and they're looking at the sacrifice of things that they care about, they're more prone to escalate. The standard argument in the debate so far has been, Americans, you're exaggerating the risk of escalation. Putin hasn't escalated and he won't escalate. And that's a misunderstanding of what escalation is. That's an assumption that escalation is this 0-1 binary jump from nothing to mushroom clouds. Escalation is gradual. Escalation is rung by rung up a ladder. Both sides have escalated repeatedly. They're continuing to escalate, and the incentives to escalate may have gone up as a result of this putsch. If we worried that Putin's mental calculus, that his internal psychology is, I'm looking at collapse, failure, humiliation, and potentially death if I don't do something.
Right.
That's the kind of scenario that creates a significant risk that somebody gambles for resurrection. And that gamble may take place on the battlefield in Ukraine, where there have been multiple escalations by both the Russians and the West already. It may happen behind the front in Ukraine in a more aggressive attack even than what we've seen so far on civilian infrastructure. It could broaden the war by moving it outside the borders of Ukraine to other. There are all sorts of dimensions that this could take, and they're worrisome.
Indeed. So now we are at 11:50. We have questions from the audience, and one of them is, kind of gets into this idea of the future of the Wagner. So looking abroad came for you. Will this mean for Russia's presence in Africa? The Wagner Group is currently in the Central African Republic, in Mali, and Eastern Libya. And Prigozhin's companies are also in Sudan. There have been talk of them going into Burkina Faso and Chad. So what are the implications for this and for the Wagner Group's activities in Africa?
So thanks, Karen. That's a great question. Certainly, Sergei Lavrov has made it clear that Russia is staying in Africa, whether or not the Wagner Group by name does. I think the most interesting question is what happens to the actual private companies that Prigozhin has been involved with, the ones who are engaged in, for example, mining activities, as opposed to the security forces, which everybody knows were always there, primarily as an underhanded Russian way of having having forces on the ground in Africa. And the only one that we know of right now that's actually been making a profit is the gold mining in Sudan. And the way we know that is because of a New York Times investigation about how the gold was being transferred through Cameroon to the United Arab Emirates and then was being melted down so that its origin wasn't clear. And somehow the profits were being flown directly to Russia. And what was really striking is that after these accusations were made, the UAE came out and said, we always work with our partners. There's no reason for us to change our working with our partners. Now, that is a Prigozhin affiliated company. But, you know, we have to remember that there's no private property protection in Russia, that it's very common to have what are called raids on firms. And so it would be trivial for Putin to decide that there should be a raid on the firms that are associated with Prigozhin. And now all of a sudden another CEO comes to the forefront, and that we still have all of the same Prigozhin firms operating as they are in Africa, but now Prigozhin's name is no longer associated with them. So I would predict that very little is going to change in Africa because it serves Russia's interest too strongly to have it continue as it has been.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. Peter, now a question for you. Thinking about the role of Belarus here, what's Lukashenko's strategy here? What's the rationale for now for intervening in this way, for hosting Prigozhin now? What does it tell you? What can we infer from this?
Thanks for the question. I've seen a variety of assessments of what happened here. And my own view is that Putin picked up the phone, called Lukashenko and said, hey, I have a job for you. This is what you need to do. And the rationale was Putin doesn't want to be directly negotiating with Prigozhin. Talk about weakening yourself. I've got this mutineer letting the group go down the highway and I'm going to talk to him. No, I'm going to have somebody else do that, be the intermediary. And Lukashenko is very, very, very dependent on Putin. Right. So and he's helped, you know, this was helpful, and he's gone out of his way to take credit for it as well. And so didn't Putin in his speech last night. So everybody benefits from that. But I was also struck, Lukashenko said, there's no winners in this little conflict and there's no heroes. It was very striking. I thought, hey, you're going out a little ahead of your skis here. It sounded like a little criticism of Putin too, because he said, we're all guilty, we're all responsible. So, wow, good for you, but I think there are limits to that.
Yeah, and so I think we have maybe time for one or two questions. Thinking about it more broadly, does it have any effect on the relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping or the Sino-Russia partnership at all? Peter?
Sure. Kim, go ahead. Kim, you go first.
Kim, go first, please.
Sure. A couple things to keep in mind. China has been very careful to stay away from a Wagner Group model in terms of the security forces that they have working on the Belt and Road Initiative abroad. And so I think this is just making Xi think even more that he made the right decision by not going down the Wagner route for private military companies. But in terms of their relationship, I mean, Xi and I don't know if it was Xi per se or the Chinese leadership came out and said that they were very glad that they had a strong partner in Russia and that they very much supported Russian sovereignty and control. And so I think that they came out on the side of Putin. But yeah, he has to be a little bit concerned about what this means, both for Putin and about what it could mean as a model inside China for what could happen to him. So I imagine that it is causing him to think more.
I agree. The only point I'd make is I was struck how quickly the Russians dispatched a deputy foreign minister to Beijing. Let me clarify what's really going on here, which again tells me just how dependent they are on China right now. They don't want to lose any kind of allegiance or support from Beijing at all.
And Steve, do you have, anything on this or no? So I guess the last question from the perspective of, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the different questions. We answered most of them. Somebody asked, what do you make of Putin's apparent disappearance from his 1917 speech on Saturday until his return yesterday? Is there anything there that we need to pay attention to?
Is the question about how long it took, you mean? What?
There were reports that he moved to St. Petersburg. Would this crisis have seemed so severe if it stayed visible? Do you make anything out of the kind of the how often he and in what way he appeared and is?
I actually was looking to see when he was going to make an appearance again, and I actually started worrying that some of the footage we were seeing on TV was old footage. I've lived through that with Yeltsin, so I was a little suspicious. But that I believe that was really a meeting this morning. Kim, you watched it, I'm sure, on the video. But I was struck by the time lag, and I think that says a lot about the degree of surprise here that this is actually unfolding the way it is, and that he really wanted to think very, very carefully about his next step. This isn't something you want to do in a hurry in an hour. And that first speech on the first night, I thought was a hurried speech. I was just so taken aback that he was so candid about what a big deal this was, and it was. But he made it worse, in my view. He made it sound like we're in a real crisis here. So I think he learned from that and decided I need some time to think through my next step here about what I'm going to say next.
Yep.
And I think he made up for it by having, two appearances today, two separate appearances with the defense officials. So he's sort of saying, I'm back and I'm still strong.
And the meeting with the students, the engineering students, did you see that? That was another, I thought, that's the one I wondered whether it was real or not, but I thought, how weird is this? But they wanted to show he was out there talking.
So, so we're at time. Let me thank you all, Kim, Steve, Peter, for doing this and in such short notice. I mean, the viewers should know this was all done over the weekend very quickly. Can we put something for our community to watch and to participate in this conversation? So thank you for doing this in such a short time. And for all of you watching, we have over 300 people who tuned in. Thank you for joining us. This is a new format that we are, a relatively new format here at SIPA. We call it Rapid Response. And you will see more and more of these webinars coming live in reaction to current events. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day or a good evening, depending on where you're joining us from the world. Have a great day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.